Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and chapter 9 is where we're going to spend our time today. And for those that have been kind of pre-reading, it's getting kind of difficult to follow some of the thoughts of Solomon. He kind of starts jumping around a little bit. And he started that in chapter 7 and he kind of continues it in chapters 8 and chapters 9. But we got to remember, as we're reading through this, the whole central message here. What's going on? Solomon, or the preacher here, has been sharing with us ways to live our life in this crazy world that we have, right? And remember, he set out to determine, how do I live my life in this world that he says is all vanity? And of course, God gave him a special measure of wisdom, didn't he? Remember that? And so if anybody could figure it out, it was going to be Solomon. And so when he gives us information in this text, remember just how he got that information. The wisest man in the world, save Christ, right? The wisest man in the world who set out to figure out this world and then tell us the meaning of life in this world, and then tell us, hey, this is what I've learned from my study, and this is how you can benefit from it. I really like chapter 7 that we studied in the last 2 weeks, because in the first part of chapter 7, verses 1 through 14, he gave us excellent counsel for a better living, how to live this life. And then in verses 15 through the end of chapter 7, he started talking about balance. And he says, you've got to have balance. Or if you don't have balance, what do you have? You got extremes, right? And what does he say about extremes? Extremes are never good. Extremes are never good. We need to be living a balanced life, staying close as we can to God, and have God help us in times of need. Now all of a sudden, we come to chapters 8 and chapters 9. And have you ever had, or I'm sure you've all heard, the two positive things, the two things that you can't get away from, the two things that are going to happen in this world are death and taxes, right? We say that all the time. So I kind of said that here, but if we want to put a little finer tune on it, what we're going to talk about today is that you cannot escape the inevitability of death, can you? Can't do it. And then you also must endure the governments of men. You ever thought about that? Those are the two things that Solomon's going to cover for us today. The inevitability of death, and you can't escape the governments of men. Now, if it was important enough for him to write down these things back so long ago, it was important back then it must be important now, right? I wonder why we can't get a handle on these two things. Think about that. Why do we struggle so much with the inevitability of death? Okay, what we're talking about, you remember, he's talking about life under the sun, which is here in the world today. So your point is correct. He says, I disagree. Christians escape death, which in all is accurate, right? But we're talking about life under the sun. We're talking about life here on this world. And really remember what we're talking about is knowing the inevitability of death must impact the way we live our life when we're alive on this earth. Okay? Yes, sir.
Really, I think one of the reasons that we struggle so much with it is because we cannot control it.
Can't control it. Hit the nail on the head. Think about that. We're not only just human beings, but we're Americans, right? And we're also Texans in this room. We like to control everything, don't we? We must control everything. And we cannot control death. And we struggle with that because we want everything on our terms. We want everything on our timeline. Because if we can control everything else in our life, why can't we control death? Well, what Solomon is spending all these chapters telling us is you really don't control much at all. You remember him talking about the world back in chapter 1? What does he say about the world? The world just goes in one big circle. And there's nothing new. Remember he kept saying there's nothing new under the sun. The things that have happened now have happened before. You just forgot about them. Such is life. So let's keep moving. But remember, when we're talking about the inevitability, don't ask me to spell it, of death, we're talking about something that will happen that we cannot control. So now what happens upon your death is largely determined by how you act and how you live in this world. That's why it's important. Okay? So let's keep moving here just a little bit. Enduring the governments of men. Think about that for a second. What does Romans chapter 13 tell us? Do you remember that? I'm going to read it because I think it's a sister passage to what we're fixing to study. Romans chapter 13 verses 1 through 7. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. We believe that, don't we? Of course. Solomon says here, and let's look at chapter 8, verses 2, 3, 4. I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment, because every matter there is a time and judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly. A wise man will understand that judgment will come in its own time. So don't resort to wickedness, i.e. rebellion, to alleviate your misery. Okay? I was reading an article yesterday in the news, and I hadn't heard what was going on. I don't keep up. I keep up with a lot of, shall we say, top headline type stuff. I'm pretty familiar with headline type stuff that happen in the news, but I don't dig real deep on a lot of the things that happen. But I read an article yesterday that somewhere up in the Northeast, a group of students at a college were protesting some new administrative type things at their college. And so they decided to have a student sit-in at one of the buildings on campus. And so they boarded up the windows and they locked all the doors. They locked themselves into this building and prevented anybody from coming in. There was a guy, he was a professor there. He grew upset over it. And he got a group of people to go cut through the locks and go take his building back. So they go in and they cut the locks. They get into an altercation. The police are called. The guy's arrested. And now he's been fired from his job. And I thought to myself, that's very similar to what Solomon is saying here. Everything has a time, and everything has a judgment. Don't be coerced into doing evil, or don't be coerced into taking action when you're not going to benefit from it. Does that make sense? He says, a wise man will understand that judgment will come in its own time. So don't resort to wickedness or rebellion to alleviate misery. And now compare that to what Romans tells us in chapter 13 that we just read. Right? As long as there's going to be governments are run by people. As long as there's people running governments, there's going to be good governments and there's going to be bad governments. Solomon is saying, be patient and wait it out, because this too shall pass. Yes?
This is talking about a situation of which there is a king who has absolute power.
Right.
And I'm interested in your thoughts on how we transfer that to a republic, which we are.
Yeah.
I know that we have had very well-known members of the church who, Brother Lipscomb was one,
Uh-huh.
felt that it was wrong to partake of any political action, including voting. And it's a thought that in a democracy, does this change somewhat? Are we to stay out of it totally? Are we to stand up for what we think is right in the voting situation?
Sure. So, if you didn't hear, Solomon is talking about kings that have dictatorial powers and the one-man show. Interesting enough, he's talking about himself. But what about the democracy that we live in, where it is a system that is designed for us to have a voice? Okay? I personally think God wants us to act like Christians from the time that we wake up in the morning to the time that we go to bed at night. God wants us to influence this world. Now, does our vote have our say in politics? Of course it does. There's nothing wrong with going out and voting for the people who we think would most represent God in our country. Nothing wrong with that. I think God would actually encourage us to do that. And I want to stop there because I don't really like the politics during the church. But that's my thought. You asked my thought, so that's my thought. Yes, sir. Right. We're difference makers. If you think about it, are we just like everybody else, or are we different? We're different and proud to be different. And we have to show ourselves different. But we can't just say it. We have to actually do it. We have to show it. Yes, sir?
I think Paul kind of addressed that when he wrote to the young preacher Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and he said, I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgiving be made on behalf of all men for kings and all who are in authority. Not just
right.
the one who rules, but when you have any kind of authority, whether it's a governor or whether it's a mayor, whether it's a police officer, whether it's the president, all those men, all those individuals in authority need to be prayed for, need to be considered the position that they're in. But also he says you pray for them so that you may lead a tranquil and quiet life. So that then the things that you do is focused not on yourself, but upon what our objective is in life. Because as we also understand from James, this life is but a vapor.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether I attain a fortune or whether I influence thousands of people. What matters is my life and the families and the individuals that I impact. Are we going towards God or are we going away from God?
That's it. That's the bottom line, right? Would you rather have a tranquil and quiet life or one filled with chaos? There's some people that love the chaos. But as for Christians, a tranquil and quiet, peaceful life is what we all strive to have, right? People in authority, look at verse 11, chapter 8, verses 11. Well, let's back up and read 10 and 11. Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the palace of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had done so. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Now, that's an interesting statement right there. Why do evil men continue to do evil? Solomon says, because the sentence for that does not happen speedily. Their punishment will be rectified, taken care of. But it doesn't always just happen tomorrow. And he says, because of this is why evil men continue to be evil. Now you think about that for a second. Here we are as Christians, we know that there's an end game to this, right? We know that we have to walk as close as we can to God so when in the end of time we fail, He covers our sin, right?
God is in control.
He is in control. That's what Solomon's saying. And He controls the timeline, and He controls what happens, and at the end, beware of being wicked. And be comfort in your fear of God. That's what He's saying. And it's so interesting. I've never thought about it this way, but He tells us, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. I think I'm going to underline that. That kind of helps me understand a few things. Because He also tells us, guess what? This life is vain because the evil don't always lose, right? And the righteous don't always win. And then He's starting to put, as we continue this study, He's starting to put all of these thoughts together, isn't He? Because He's starting to go back to the central theme is the righteous fear God and the evil love themselves. And God at the end of time will take care of it all. Be patient. Don't get to extremes. Respect your rulers. And if you don't like your ruler, hold your breath, because I'm going to make a change. Don't go off the deep end and do something that's not right and is not who you are, and disappoint yourself and those people that are looking to you to be leaders in this community. That's kind of what he's saying. I like letter C here at the bottom of the first page. Expect to be perplexed. Okay? How many times have you ever read something or you seen something or you hear about something and you just go, what? Happens to you all the time. Expect to be perplexed. Verse 14. There is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. We're talking about what we just kind of said. The righteous don't always win and the wicked don't always lose. That's what he's talking about in verse 14. Verse 15, so I commend enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry, for this will remain with him in his labor all of his days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. What's he saying? He's saying, find a way to enjoy this crazy world. And he's saying, you remember in chapter 2 and chapter 3, you remember what he said? What is the gift of God to the Christian? The gift of God is your ability to enjoy your labors. Right? So those walking in lockstep with God, He gives you the gift of enjoying this life. And what is that gift? The more that we talk about it, it's the gift to be content in whatever phase you're in. It's the gift not to get too extremes. You don't pull your hair out because your elected official didn't get the job. Right? We learn to be content. And we learn to have that healthy fear of God, to know we have to trust Him to take care of all this stuff in the end, and that He will. Knowing the end game allows us to enjoy this life. Right? Enjoying life is page 2. We just talked about that. I like kind of the summary statement here. The very top of page 2. There's little value in getting all worked up about the wickedness in the governments of men. As long as there are imperfect men, there will be imperfect governments. It is better to simply obey the laws, do good, trust in God, and enjoy the fruits of one's labor. If we do that, what do we have? We have a content person that's happy in their position in life and enjoying this crazy ride. Right? And isn't that where we want to be? We don't want to be standing around pulling our hair out every day. Let's go on to number 2. Enduring the inevitability of death. Death happens to all. This is what we can't control, because it happens to the righteous and it happens to the wicked, doesn't it? It happens to good people and it happens to bad people at often inopportune times in their life, right? The righteous are in God's hands. But what about the evil? God deals with them too. But the righteous, let's focus on the righteous. We know that God will take care of us in the end, to your point earlier. Right? You ever thought about what happens immediately when you die? If you're the righteous, what a joyous time that is. And if you're not the righteous, you immediately say, uh-oh. I got a problem that I can't fix. While we live, there is hope. Chapter 9, verse 4. But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. While we live, there's hope. Hope in what? Hope in God, hope in God's plan, hope in Christ and how He fits in our lives, and hope that we become the people that we're called to be the righteous. The second we take our last breath, there is no hope. This is important stuff.
It's better to even live like a dog than be a dead.
Yeah, I didn't read that part, but I'm glad you did. The very end of chapter 9, verse 4. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. Leave it to you to bring that up. You know, the other thing that Solomon goes back to time and time again is in verse 5. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Time and time again, Solomon goes back to this statement about it doesn't matter how cool you think you are. It doesn't matter what all you've really accomplished in life. Give enough time and people will forget about you. That's kind of sobering. Well, surely people aren't going to forget about me. You know, there was a group of people that brought the church to White House a long, long, long time ago. I wonder if we can name those people. We are the church that's in this community that was started by a group of people that maybe we've forgotten. Long, long time ago.
We don't. I've never even looked that up.
My point. We're living our own lives with things to do, and
Important that the church exists today.
absolutely it is. No, absolutely. That's not a pass or fail question to get to the pearly gates, right?
The Bible, you know, if it doesn't say something in there, it's because it's not important.
Right. One of my favorite, I got 10 minutes, so I'm going to move us on a little bit. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is right here in chapter 9, verse 10. Solomon says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. I wonder what Solomon's trying to tell us there. I can tell you what I think. He says, be excellent. Don't be average. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. Be the best. Be excellent. And don't settle for being average.
And then Paul add to that in Colossians where he says, do it heartily as though you're doing it for God.
That's right.
And not for men.
Does anybody want to be average? Does anybody just want to be okay? Or do we want to be great? Great is what grows a church. Great is what makes a difference. And from the sales perspective, great is what moves the needle of a company. It's not average. We need to constantly think about that. Expect the unexpected. In verse 11, we've kind of talked about this. Time and chance happens to all. Being swift and strong does not mean you'll always win. Being wise and understanding doesn't always ensure you're going to have to be prosperous. And then verse 12. For man also does not know this time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. To the comments before, we can't control when death happens, can we? Oftentimes, it becomes upon us unexpectedly. There was a man that was out fishing with his grandson. He was about 70. Grandson was about 5. He was in the boat, and there was another boat that was close to him, and they just happened to be looking over, and they saw the man trip and fall into the lake. The folks kind of went over there. They didn't see him come up. So one of the other fishermen jumped in, went down there and grabbed him, pulled him up. And it took both of the guys in the other boat everything they could to get him out of the water and saved his life. That happened on Friday. Now, you know what that man said? When he finally got his breath back and he looked at those people that saved his life, he said, "You just saved my life." He goes, "I almost lost everything I had." Like that. And it just so happened 2 strangers happened to be going by at the same time and looked and saw the guy fall in. And his 5-year-old grandson didn't have to watch him die that day. We never know when accidents happen, when it's just our time, when medical issues come around. We don't know, so we have to be prepared. We have to be prepared with a healthy fear of God. And we've got to enjoy life while we have it. And I understand too. Sometimes I look at Kimberly and I'm like, enjoy life, man. This life's killing me. Right? I get it. But we have to see the big picture. It's not always about our ups and downs right here. It's about enjoying the life that God's given us, enjoying this church, enjoying the people, enjoying your wife, your spouse. You know, he even talks about that a little bit farther down here. It talks about enjoying, in verse 9, live joyfully with the wife God has given you. He understands the family unit. Enjoy it. Enjoy it because we never know how long it's going to last, right?
Those 2 men, why they were there to save that man's life. But when you think about all of the times that God has moved whenever we've made mistakes and put things in our way so that we could realize our mistakes. You look at Abraham, David. I mean, over and over we see how God will move things around, but that's always time.
Right. That's right. We always see it in the mirror, right? The last thing in chapter 9, starting in verse 13 through 18, my Bible says, wisdom is superior to folly. Interesting story there about how wisdom and the power and the strength of wisdom. And he says that there was this city, small city, and that there was a great king who came in and besieged the city and tried to take it over and all this stuff. And it's there in verses 13 through 18. And he says there was a real poor man that was wise. And he alludes to the fact that nobody ever listened to him and that it was, oh, he's a poor guy, don't listen to him, he doesn't know anything. But he says that his wisdom saved the city. So he knew something, he said something, and when people listened, it was able to deliver the city from the great king that was trying to overthrow it. So what's the lesson there? He says the value of wisdom is better than strength and better than weapons of war. And he says, though often despised when it comes from a poor man, wisdom spoken quietly is better than the shout of the ruler of fools. Walk softly, carry a big stick. Be humble. Be measured in what you say. And when you start to talk, people will listen. But if you just go around screaming and yelling all the time and you're a know-it-all, guess what? Nobody cares about anything you have to say. Be humble and measured in your Christian walk with God. The conclusion is basically just kind of going over what we went through today. I wanted to develop a few of the topics a little more. We just had a lot of ground to cover. Thank y'all for coming today, and we'll see you next week.